Pacifica and the sovereignty of the human person. Resistance, natural rights, and the moral rejection of manufactured authority. There are moments in political history when a declaration ceases to function merely as a political instrument and instead becomes a metaphysical statement about the nature of the human person. The American Declaration of Independence was one such moment. It was not simply a colonial grievance document. It was an assertion that legitimate authority begins not in institutions, dynasties, bureaucracies, or empires, but in the inherent dignity and sovereignty of the individual human being. Pacifica operates within that same tradition, though filtered through the anxieties, technologies, and crises of the modern age. It emerges as more than a manifesto. It becomes a symbolic doctrine of resistance against systems perceived as hostile to the autonomy of mind, speech, conscience, and civic self-determination. At its philosophical core, Pacifica advances a single, foundational proposition: political legitimacy derives upward from sovereign persons rather than downward from ruling structures. The state is not sacred. Institutions are not inherently moral merely because they possess force. Authority is conditional, contractual, and morally subordinate to natural rights. Once institutions violate the rights they were established to secure, they lose the moral certainty upon which their legitimacy depends. This argument places Pacifica within a long tradition of natural law political philosophy stretching from classical thought through English common law, Enlightenment constitutionalism, and anti-tyrannical republican theory. Yet it simultaneously reflects modern anxieties concerning surveillance, propaganda, semantic manipulation, digital censorship, bureaucratic expansion, and the conversion of citizens into psychologically managed populations. The result is a fusion of constitutional rhetoric and cultural criticism, a declaration that sovereignty begins in the conscience of the individual and that freedom cannot survive where language itself becomes colonized by power. The crisis of language and the architecture of control. Modern political power rarely announces itself openly as domination. It speaks instead through euphemism, managed narratives, therapeutic vocabulary, public relations language, and moral abstractions engineered to discourage scrutiny. Pacifica recognizes this transformation and identifies linguistic control as one of the central mechanisms through which contemporary authority sustains itself. The argument is neither superficial nor merely rhetorical. It reflects a profound philosophical insight: language structures perception. Human beings interpret reality through categories, definitions, and conceptual boundaries. Whoever controls those categories gradually influences the limits of political imagination itself. When words lose stable meaning, truth becomes negotiable. Once truth becomes negotiable, power no longer requires persuasion grounded in reality. It requires only repetition, emotional conditioning, and institutional reinforcement. This concern echoes through some of the most influential dystopian narratives of modern literature. In 1984, language is systematically compressed until independent thought itself becomes difficult to formulate. In Fahrenheit 451, censorship operates not only through prohibition but through cultural sedation and the destruction of intellectual seriousness. In The Hunger Games, spectacle replaces citizenship, reducing political life to emotional manipulation performed for mass consumption. These narratives differ in setting and style, yet they converge upon the same warning: societies lose freedom long before they recognize they have become unfree. Pacifica situates itself as a direct resistance to those patterns. It warns against surveillance normalized as safety, censorship disguised as responsibility, obedience framed as virtue, and ideological conformity presented as social harmony. Most importantly, it rejects the idea that citizens should inherit their worldview passively from institutions claiming epistemic authority over public reality. The critique extends beyond government alone. It encompasses the broader machinery of narrative production: corporate media systems, technological platforms, bureaucratic language, entertainment spectacle, and socially enforced ideological scripts. In this framework, domination becomes increasingly psychological rather than overtly physical. Citizens are not always compelled through visible violence. They are guided through managed perception. This is why Pacifica treats dissent as a civic duty rather than a disruptive pathology. Independent thought becomes morally necessary in a culture where official narratives increasingly function as instruments of social regulation. To question prevailing assumptions is therefore not merely intellectual curiosity. It is an act of civic self-defense. Natural rights and the moral origin of law. At the center of Pacifica lies the doctrine of natural rights. This doctrine asserts that human beings possess intrinsic rights independent of governmental recognition. Rights are not permissions issued by institutions. They are inherent conditions of human dignity itself. The distinction is decisive. If governments create rights, governments may revoke them whenever politically expedient. But if rights are pre-political, then institutions remain permanently accountable to moral standards beyond themselves. Law becomes legitimate only insofar as it protects what already belongs to the person by nature. Pacifica repeatedly invokes rights as unalienable, natural, and inherent. Life, liberty, conscience, property, self-defense, privacy, and voluntary association are treated not as administrative grants but as expressions of human sovereignty. Government exists to secure these rights rather than define them. This philosophical structure closely resembles the natural law traditions underlying English common law and classical liberal constitutionalism. Under those traditions, law was not understood merely as sovereign command. Legitimate law reflected reasoned justice rooted in reciprocity, restraint, and moral limitation. Arbitrary power was viewed as fundamentally incompatible with lawful government because authority detached from moral principle eventually degenerates into coercion. Pacifica revives this distinction by separating lawful authority from raw institutional power. A system may possess procedural legality while simultaneously violating natural justice. Governments may remain formally constitutional while becoming substantively authoritarian if they undermine the liberties from which constitutional legitimacy originally derived. This distinction between legality and legitimacy is essential to the Declaration's argument. The mere existence of bureaucratic procedure does not guarantee moral authority. Institutions derive legitimacy from consent, transparency, reciprocity, and fidelity to rights. Once they systematically violate those principles, they begin eroding the foundation of their own authority. Pacifica therefore presents resistance not as hostility toward law itself, but as fidelity to higher law against institutions perceived as corrupted or self-contradictory. It frames civic resistance as restorative rather than destructive. The goal is not chaos. The goal is the re-establishment of moral legitimacy. Consent and the foundations of legitimate government. No principle appears more central to Pacifica than the doctrine of consent. The legitimacy of political authority depends upon the voluntary participation of free individuals capable of informed judgment. Consent is not treated as a symbolic ritual. It is treated as the moral foundation of government itself. This principle has deep roots within constitutional thought. Under the social contract tradition, individuals consent to limited forms of governance because institutions protect their fundamental rights more effectively than isolated existence could. Yet this arrangement remains conditional. Government is justified only insofar as it preserves the liberties that warranted consent in the first place. Pacifica argues that contemporary systems increasingly undermine authentic consent through manipulation, opacity, and narrative control. Citizens are encouraged to obey but discouraged from questioning. Political participation becomes ceremonial while substantive power migrates toward bureaucratic, technological, financial, and media institutions insulated from meaningful accountability. The Declaration's critique becomes especially forceful regarding systems that manage populations psychologically rather than overtly through brute force. Manipulation is treated as morally equivalent to coercion because both compromise genuine autonomy. A population deprived of truthful information cannot meaningfully consent. A citizen conditioned through propaganda and fear cannot fully exercise sovereign judgment. This insight reflects one of Pacifica's deepest philosophical concerns: freedom requires epistemic integrity. Truth is not merely a cultural preference. It is the necessary condition for legitimate self-governance. Once institutions systematically distort reality, democratic forms begin losing substantive legitimacy even if procedural structures formally remain intact. Pacifica therefore frames civil resistance as a defense of the original moral basis of lawful government. Resistance becomes necessary precisely because genuine law has allegedly been replaced by managerial domination disguised as democratic process. This position aligns with long-standing constitutional traditions recognizing that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The emphasis upon just powers is crucial. Power alone does not create legitimacy. Legitimacy emerges from the reciprocal relationship between authority and liberty. The sovereignty of the individual person. Perhaps the most radical aspect of Pacifica is its insistence that sovereignty ultimately resides in the individual human being rather than the collective abstraction of the state. Modern political systems frequently elevate institutions above persons. Citizens become statistical categories, economic units, ideological constituencies, or administratively managed populations. Pacifica rejects this inversion entirely. Institutions exist for persons, persons do not exist for institutions. This philosophical reversal carries immense implications. If individuals possess intrinsic dignity independent of state recognition, then no authority may rightfully reduce them to expendable instruments serving bureaucratic objectives. Human beings cannot morally be treated as programmable subjects within systems designed primarily for efficiency, compliance, or social management. Pacifica therefore presents emancipation not merely as political independence but as moral and existential self-possession. Freedom becomes inseparable from conscience, judgment, and responsibility. The sovereign individual is not merely liberated from external domination. He becomes accountable for governing himself. This distinction matters profoundly because Pacifica does not define liberty as passive entitlement. Freedom requires civic virtue. A population incapable of independent thought cannot remain politically free regardless of constitutional structures. Self-government demands intellectual discipline, moral courage, and willingness to resist manipulation. The Declaration thus revives an older republican understanding of liberty in which freedom depended upon civic character rather than procedural formalities alone. A passive society inevitably generates concentrated power because disengagement creates political vacuums readily occupied by centralized institutions. Pacifica identifies this dynamic as one of the central crises of modern civilization. Citizens increasingly outsource moral judgment to authorities claiming expertise, technological superiority, or ideological legitimacy. As responsibility diminishes, dependency expands. Institutions grow more intrusive precisely because individuals surrender the burden of self-rule. Against this tendency, Pacifica advances a rival vision grounded in moral autonomy. The individual conscience becomes the primary site of sovereignty. Political renewal therefore begins internally before it manifests institutionally. A society capable of liberty must first consist of persons capable of independent judgment. Propaganda, conformity, and the erosion of civic agency. Pacifica's critique of modern society centers heavily upon the relationship between propaganda and passivity. It argues that contemporary systems maintain stability not only through law and economics but through psychological normalization. Citizens are encouraged to internalize obedience until conformity appears synonymous with morality itself. This process is especially dangerous because it operates subtly. The most effective systems of domination rarely rely exclusively upon overt repression. They cultivate voluntary compliance through fear, social pressure, emotional manipulation, and semantic framing. Public discourse becomes increasingly constrained not always by explicit censorship, but by the gradual narrowing of acceptable thought. Under such conditions, citizens begin policing themselves. Speech becomes performative. Independent judgment becomes socially hazardous. The distinction between civic participation and ideological compliance gradually collapses. Pacifica interprets this phenomenon as a direct threat to democratic legitimacy. A society cannot remain genuinely free if citizens lose the capacity for intellectual independence. Freedom of speech without freedom of thought becomes hollow. Elections without informed agency become ritualized theater. The Declaration therefore emphasizes the moral necessity of questioning dominant narratives. This does not mean reflexive contrarianism or rejection of all authority. Rather, it means preserving the civic responsibility to examine, evaluate, and challenge institutional claims. Democracy requires active citizens, not passive spectators. Pacifica's warnings about conformity resonate strongly within broader historical patterns. Authoritarian systems throughout history have relied upon social atomization, fear, propaganda, and ideological simplification. The methods evolve technologically, yet the underlying principle remains constant. Populations become easier to govern when independent judgment deteriorates. For Pacifica, the defense against this deterioration is civic consciousness itself. Citizens must recover the confidence to think, speak, investigate, and dissent without requiring institutional permission. Freedom survives only where moral courage survives. Resistance as civic renewal. Despite its confrontational tone, Pacifica is not fundamentally nihilistic. It does not advocate destruction for its own sake. Rather, it presents itself as a movement of civic restoration grounded in natural law, constitutional legitimacy, and moral accountability. This distinction is essential. Pacifica rejects unjust authority, not social order itself. Indeed, the Declaration repeatedly appeals to principles traditionally associated with lawful governance: transparency, consent, reciprocity, decentralization, and the protection of rights. The critique is directed not against civilization but against institutions perceived as violating the conditions necessary for legitimate civilization. Pacifica therefore belongs to a long-standing political tradition in which resistance is justified precisely because justice matters. Governments become self-defeating when they undermine the rights from which their legitimacy derives. As trust collapses, systems increasingly depend upon surveillance, propaganda, and coercive administration to maintain stability. The result is political alienation on a civilizational scale. The Declaration interprets modern governance through this lens. It portrays contemporary societies as suffering from a crisis of legitimacy rooted in disconnection from moral principle. Citizens feel increasingly managed rather than represented. Public discourse grows more performative and less truthful. Institutions appear more concerned with preserving authority than securing liberty. Against this backdrop, Pacifica proposes civic renewal through the recovery of sovereign agency. Citizens must cease functioning as passive recipients of institutional narratives and resume responsibility for public life. Freedom requires participation, vigilance, and self-governance. This emphasis upon responsibility distinguishes Pacifica from purely anarchic or nihilistic movements. Liberty is inseparable from accountability. The sovereign individual must cultivate discipline, reason, and civic virtue. Without those qualities, resistance degenerates into fragmentation rather than renewal. Pacifica therefore frames emancipation as both liberation and obligation. To reclaim sovereignty is simultaneously to reclaim responsibility for one's own judgment, conduct, and participation in the civic order. Human dignity and the future of self-government. The enduring significance of Pacifica lies not merely in its political proposals, but in the deeper human anxiety it expresses. Beneath its constitutional rhetoric and cultural criticism lies a profound concern that modern civilization increasingly treats human beings as manageable resources rather than morally sovereign persons. This concern reflects one of the defining tensions of modernity. Technological systems grow more sophisticated, institutions more centralized, and information environments more immersive. At the same time, individuals often feel increasingly alienated from meaningful civic agency. Political participation becomes symbolic while substantive power concentrates elsewhere. Pacifica responds to this condition by reasserting a foundational principle of free civilization: the human person possesses dignity prior to institutional recognition. Governments are legitimate only insofar as they protect that dignity. Once institutions begin subordinating persons to systems of permanent management, they invert the moral order from which authority originally derived. This is why Pacifica repeatedly invokes natural law rather than mere procedural legality. Constitutions matter because they recognize truths about human freedom that precede government itself. Rights are not sacred because states acknowledge them. States are legitimate because they acknowledge rights. The Declaration ultimately advances a moral vision in which liberty depends upon courage, truthfulness, and independent thought. Citizens must resist not only external domination but internal passivity. A free society cannot survive if individuals relinquish the burden of conscience in exchange for psychological comfort or institutional dependency. Pacifica therefore presents freedom as a continuous act of civic vigilance. Self-government is not a permanent achievement secured once and forever through constitutional forms. It is an ongoing moral discipline requiring populations capable of reasoned dissent and ethical self-rule. Its central insight remains deeply resonant: authority exists for human beings, not human beings for authority. That principle stands at the heart of every serious philosophy of liberty. It animated constitutional revolutions against monarchy, fueled resistance against totalitarianism, and continues shaping contemporary debates concerning surveillance, censorship, technological governance, and civil autonomy. Pacifica translates that enduring principle into the language of modern crisis, warning that societies lose freedom not only through visible oppression but through gradual habituation to managed thought and conditioned obedience. The final message is neither despair nor simple rebellion. It is a declaration that human dignity survives wherever individuals retain the courage to think independently, speak honestly, and refuse to surrender moral sovereignty to institutions demanding obedience without reciprocal legitimacy. Freedom begins when human beings remember that they are citizens before subjects, persons before statistics, and moral agents before instruments of power.